Welcome boys and girls, Costin here with a discussion about Tyrion, who should be a fairly prominent character in Lords of the End Times, or in the End Time events in general, because he definitely was one of the prominent characters in the actual lore. And I think that's something that should be reflected in the kind of decision making he should have in his campaign. Now, don't get me wrong, Tyrion is a really good character and a really powerful legendary lord without a doubt. But he definitely needs at least some events, something, to really just add that extra bit of punch to make his campaign a bit more worthwhile to play. Because as it currently stands, he's a great generic lord for the High Elves, and he's really good at it, but you kind of benefit more from playing other campaigns and confederating Tyrion, like, say, playing Alariel and confederating Tyrion, or playing Ulthuan and confederating Tyrion, than you do actually playing him. The mechanics he has, the Champion of Ulthuan and the Alliance's mechanic, are useful, but they do not compare to the sheer potential that Ulthuan and Alariel do have. And that's saying something, considering the fact that Creative Assembly did rework Tyrion, and they didn't rework Ulthuan and Alariel. For Alariel, it's the fact that she has a lot more handmaidens. For Ulthuan, it's just he has a lot of money and influence, which is incredibly powerful. Don't get me wrong, Tyrion does have a lot of influence that he gains through battles, but he doesn't have the same big purse of cash that Ulthuan has walking around him all the time. And even the influence benefit, considering the fact that his main mechanic requires him to spend influence, doesn't end up necessarily being that big of a benefit compared to others. I mean, sure, you can use all that influence for his mechanics, or you can use it to just recruit archmages, princes, sea helms, princesses as well. Or you can just bypass it, use Administrator, and just nullify and use the load save character system, nullify the entire influence system altogether. And having that kind of influence for the seats in itself is not necessarily that important, I would dare say. Because ultimately, when we're talking about these kind of things, when we're talking about the campaign structure, when we're talking about what the Legendary Lord could be and should be, the simple reality of it is he could do better. He's always been one of the strongest Legendary Lords in the game ever since he was introduced in Warhammer 2. But let's consider the lore of him in the End Times. When we look at End Times, Tyrion lost his daughter, and he moved with an army to try and recover it. He sided or teamed up with Thorgrim to try and do so. They failed to do so, and then he got really pissed off the dwarves, and then went back to Ulthuan after his daughter was sacrificed to bring back Nagash, and decided, you know what would be a fun time at this point? Let's just really split the entirety of Ulthuan down the middle after Finnebar's death. And yeah, you can blame Teclis for that one. You can also say Tyrion, who has always been very rash in his actions, played right into Malekith's hands. He pulled out the Widowmaker, he did a bunch of very questionable stuff, or really horrific stuff, if you want to be quite honest on it. And maybe that's the kind of mechanic he should have in his campaign, because he does have that pull towards the Widowmaker. But pulling the Widowmaker should have consequences in his campaign specifically. Generally speaking, pulling out the Widowmaker does create consequences. But the thing about High Elves, due to handmaidens and their vast diplomatic benefit and their strong building up economy, even in this red climate situation, the Widowmaker does not create the kind of downsides that it should. The Widowmaker may be something that you could use as Tyrion, but it should create a kind of balancing action. The way Creative Assembly handles that personal balancing of Tyrion is that they do it for a skill line, except Majesty of Ulthuan beats Bloodline of Venarian right out of the park, because you don't need Bloodline of Venarian. There's almost no situation in any campaign whatsoever where going Bloodline of Venarian, losing control, and just getting Tyrion more combat power, which he has a plenty, would be worth it compared to controlling all provinces, global recruitment duration, and also upkeep 10% and corruption in a local province. That's the thing. You can have whatever mechanic you want, but it has to be meaningful and it has to be impactful. And I believe that that is something Creative Assembly should have done with Tyrion's rework. Not keep the skill line as is, but instead create an entire campaign mechanic around him balancing the Bloodline of Venarian and the Majesty of Ulthuan. Because Tyrion is ultimately a hero. He's all very heroic. He's self-sacrificing. He will go a long way towards trying to protect his people. Of course, that he doesn't care about other people is one of his failings. He's not perfect, and that's the thing. He's not meant to be perfect. The reality is, most High Elven, or the good High Elven characters, tend to be against the norms of their race, really. Because you look at High Elves, they're kind of like Imric, arrogant, self-assured, hating war and all that kind of stuff. Well, Imric doesn't hate war, but still, poets, etc. Tyrion loves war, but he also wants peace, so he's kind of in that tension point all the same between what he feels, the bloodline of an Aryan, and also what he thinks he should be. And that's really the tragedy of Tyrion in the end times, that he tipped way too far towards the Widowmaker and the bloodline of an Aryan, as opposed to choosing a better option, because it was right there on the table. We can blame Teclis all we want for the things that ultimately ended up unfolding, but it was Tyrion's decisions, his own personal decisions, even driven by grief at the loss of his daughter, that created the disaster in Ulthuan, that led to the sinking of Ulthuan, the destruction of everything the High Elves had built, and the deaths of a great deal of High Elves and Dark Elves. And that is really the problem that ultimately existed in the end times with Tyrion. And maybe with the end times DLC/expansion, that should be one of those decisions you make, and it should be impactful. I believe that one of the endgame crises that Creative Assembly is working on, or one of the endgame events, one of the end times, will be revolving around High Elves versus Dark Elves. And what I think will be important, that if you're playing High Elf or Dark Elf or even Wood Elf, is how you resolve that tension point. And I think Tyrion and Malekith are really at the center of that specific discussion, that specific decision point, assuming Creative Assembly is going to do anything of value whatsoever with it. And bear in mind, Creative Assembly has stated very clearly, very directly, that they are aiming to have these end-time events and these kind of ramping up endgame crises in campaigns. They're not just going to affect the new lords, they're going to affect the existing lords. And this is one of those campaigns where it can benefit from a lot. Maybe that's kind of the reason why they didn't add a balancing point with Tyrion, because maybe they're looking to do so in the actual mechanic of the High Elf versus Dark Elf civil war, because it is a civil war at the end of the day from a lore perspective. Mechanics-wise, I've already talked about what High Elves need. I've always said handmaidens, heroes in general, should be tier 2 recruitment. The influence recruitment system is not really great, etc., etc. There's always that kind of discussion that does exist. But the fundamental aspect of Tyrion, I wouldn't say issue, but the fundamental aspect of Tyrion is he is that balance point. He is that tension point in the High Elves, just like Malekith is the tension point in the Dark Elves. And that's one of the things that I hope is reflected in Lords of the End Times as a DLC. Whenever it comes out, I imagine it's going to be coming out in late August, maybe a bit earlier, depends on the schedule. Could be earlier, could be much earlier. Who knows exactly how Creative Assembly is going to handle that. But that's all I had to say. Costin signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications. And I'll see you boys and girls on the next one. If you do enjoy my content, well, I would ask you to consider donating via PayPal, Patreon, or through YouTube channel membership. It is greatly appreciated, considering everything that's happened.